So we're going to talk about how to use admission tests for college applications. And as we delve into that, we're also going to sort of delve into the new developments on the SAT side with the arrival of the digital test. And I think I can click here and move forward. There we go. So here's where we are right now, with the whole shift over the last couple years of going into the test optional posture. And in all, most schools are test optional. We have the Florida State schools, which never came out of their test required position and have stayed in it. The University of Georgia returned to requiring scores. The University of Tennessee returned to requiring scores. And then we have our Georgetown, which has never met a test it didn't like. And MIT returned to requiring scores. And their reasoning was that they were finding that the students were just not ready for the rigor, and it was just a fact check that they were very interested in having. But other than that, out there, chances are when your child comes up to August of their senior year, most of the colleges on their list are going to give them the option to send a score or not. So we combine that with what had already become very popular, which is what we call the multi-school apps. So your Common App, your Coalition, HBCUs also have their own form of the college app. Theirs is actually Common App. Theirs is actually great. You pay one fee, and for any of the schools you apply to, Common App users, you're still going to pay the school's fee, but it at least allows your student to fill out one application that will cover the majority of requirements for the schools on their list. So you combine that with the need to not send schools, and all of a sudden we really have an increase. Not only this has applications submitted to competitive schools, but really an increase to applications to most schools across the board. And what does that lead to? Well, the schools can't get exponentially bigger to go along with the great raises they've had in applications. So it means decreased admission rates. So maybe a school 4 years ago was 30% admission, and today it's 20% admission. We've seen your super selective schools. Usually Stanford was the winner pre-COVID, coming in at about 3 or 4% admission rate. But now we see kind of all the Ivies at that very low number, and the secondary schools behind those coming up close behind with admission rates in the teens. For class of 2023, applicants were up 20% and applications up 25%. So it means we do have more people applying, but we also have people applying to more schools than they used to. So initially after COVID, it wasn't so much that we had new kids applying, but we did see students applying to more schools. And that was because, of course, with test requirements being dropped, suddenly schools that you might have felt were out of reach for you were not out of reach for you, because the scores were not a barrier to getting that application in. And we kind of use UMD as our case study. So it's just a very good numbers above board to see how this has really affected a particular school. A lot of parents come to us, they have their list of schools, and sometimes that list will finish with, in our safety school is University of Maryland. College Park is nobody's safety school anymore. And you can kind of see it's always been a very competitive school, most competitive school in Maryland. But if we just look at our applied, admitted, enrolled past 3 years, number of applications is up 76% just in the 2 years that we have run this for. And they did admit more students, so they were able to take on 18% more students. And when you admit, not everybody you admit enrolls, so the enroll comes down to 9%. But what that did is take us from an area when we were in fall of 2020, where you had about a 50% shot at getting into UMD, to where we've now got about a 34% shot of getting into UMD. So, once any kind of school falls below that 40% admit rate, it could be considered a competitive school. And you can see also here is a very good illustration of test score inflation. So pre-COVID, still needed strong scores if you were going to apply to Maryland. 1,300 at the bottom line, 29 at the top line. or for bottom for ACT, but now we are at the point where we're really looking at midpoints of 1445 and 33s. So most students at this point are going test optional to UMD. I judge, looking at their numbers from the last common data set, about a third of the kids submitted scores. And so this is where the test optional becomes a double-edged sword, right? You get the choice to send your scores, and you go out and you prep, or you just naturally wander into a test and you do wonderful and you get awesome scores. But because schools are just allowing the students who want to send their scores to send scores, and of course those students have scores that are really, really awesome, that means the average score for any school is now inflated to just that roughly 30% of kids that feel comfortable enough to send their scores. So that means at Maryland, we want to be somewhere between 1380, at least 1380 if you're going to send those scores, and at least a 31 on your ACT. And you're going to find that at all the schools on your list that are test optional. So whereas a certain score would have been good enough 4 or 5 years ago, we're actually going to need a much higher score for that school because of its test optional policy. So it's sort of the negative effect to going with the optional piece. So if you do choose to pursue scores and you plan to use them, you just have to keep in mind that they're going to need to be stronger than they used to. But at the same time, you're not going to have to use them. So generally, I recommend to my kids, you're going to have your list, and when it all comes down to it, you'll make that decisions when the applications go out about which schools your scores are going to go to and which they are not. I'm just double checking that I haven't left anybody sitting in the waiting room. Okay. Now I can't get that to go away, so that was probably a mistake. Hang in there, folks. Okay, there we go. All right. All right, let's clear my doodles. Okay, I shouldn't have done that. There's an eraser. Okay, so how do we combat this whole inflated score list is so that we have reasonable expectations for what we're going to do with our schools. So we need to have a balanced college list. All right. So that means that no competitive school is assured because of the increased applications and new review process. So we really encourage our parents to look at this through a different lens. It's not whether your child is, if your child meets the grade averages going in and the test score averages going in, they've checked off the courses that they need, they meet what that school is looking for. That's no guarantee of admission because most of these schools have very low admit rates. So it is really, to a certain extent, it's not a lottery, but you have to be prepared to be turned down from schools that you are perfectly well fit for. And it won't be because of you or any reason like that. There's just a lot of well fit kids applying to that particular school. So you want to create a list of schools. So think about what you want, think about what your child wants, big school, little school, in the city, in the country, a campus unto itself, or more like an urban environment. Do they want to be able to pledge their flat? Do they want to be able to go to a football game? Would they rather not deal with the whole rigmarole of what the football game entails on a Saturday? Those are the sorts of things they just want to start thinking about to decide what might be a good fit: big, medium, small. And you're going to kind of put them into 3 buckets, and you want to have a pretty even out list, somewhere between, say, 6 and 9 schools. You can go more than that, but that's a lot of work for a child coming off of having a senior this year, I can tell you that. Probable is where the student's academic credentials meet or exceed that school's range for average first year students. So that means the average incoming GPA and the test scores, your child's GPA and test scores exceed those numbers. And there is some certainty you will be admitted to many of these schools. They should not just be on your list because they are a safety school. They should be on this list because that school has something to offer you. You are comfortable in that environment, you like the program, and you would be happy to attend there. And you should show some interest to them. In this brave new world, safety schools have learned that if you don't reach out to them, if you don't come to any tours, if you don't communicate with admissions at all, you're probably just on their list because they think you're an easy get, or they think it's an easy get. And you may be likely to be passed over by a student who did express some interest in that school. Possible schools. So this is where you're going to fall within that 25th to 75th percentile for grade scores, class rank. I know it's tough in Montgomery County because we don't really do the rank, fall into the average range for the most recently accepted class. And now there's no guarantees, but you should expect to get into some of these schools. This is almost like an SAT exam. You're going to get most of the probables, some of the possibles, and probably just a few of the unlikelies should you sit down to take the test. Highly selective schools are a lottery for everyone now, even highly qualified candidates. You know, Harvard's down to that 3.19. And what this means is that 97% of the kids who apply are going to get a no. And I would say out of that 97%, probably at least 80% of those students are well enough qualified to go there. So just going into this process means having some reasonable expectations. It doesn't mean you shouldn't put those schools on your list. You should certainly reach for the stars, but the list should not be weighted with too many unlikely schools because inevitably disappointment will probably follow. And you do want to have a lot of choices, not only amongst different programs and schools that you can attend, but against the different financial obligations that those schools might put on the table for you. And keep in mind that the more selective the school, using their early decision rounds do fill a large percentage of their class. So we as a philosophy only recommend going early decision if it is your absolute heart of heart school. So there's early decision, there's early action. Early decision is a binding agreement, meaning you apply to that school and you say, if you say yes to me, I say yes to you, and I withdraw my application from all the other schools. And you need to also be prepared to maybe not get as much as a financial support offer as you might get going in a later admit date or a later admission cycle because they know they have you, right? There's still going to be an offer. It just might not be as robust since they know that they have you a little bit. Now, some schools are developing what they call a friendly ED process, where you do get the opportunity to review that financial offer. And if it's not a fit for you and your family, you are able to extract yourself from it. Now, if it's an early action school, you definitely want to drop on any of those early deadlines. Schools do fill a good portion of their classes from those early runs, and you will increase your likelihood of admission by taking advantage of those dates. Okay, deep breath and can't figure out how to move to the next slide. There we go. So what's going into an application? The bulk of what matters here. So this table is kind of a visual representation of how important these things are to the schools, right? Your GPA and your course rigor is the #1 player, especially in a test optional environment. What classes did you take? Did you take AP courses or did you take honors courses? Were you successful in those courses? Now, you do have to keep in mind that you will have a weighted GPA and a standard GPA. Most schools are going to honor that weighted GPA and take the credit for that. Some schools, like UVA, when you go to submit your transcript, you will find that they don't take the weighted averages. So you need to do a little research into some of those schools and make sure you know what your grades are going to look like when they come out on the end, because you might go in thinking that your weighted GPA is going to be your representative number. And then when you go to apply, find out that it'll be your standard GPA. Your test scores, those are a fact check for the school. So we talk about why they're important. We'll talk about a little bit more later, but it should complement and reinforce the caliber of student that you are. If you have some, if your GPA has some weak points, it's maybe not as consistent as it could have been, regardless of causes, a strong test score is a very good way to help offset that. If you have a stellar GPA, a good test score is a way to reassure the school that you're not coming, from some place where grade inflation is well at work. Honors and awards, ways that you have stood out, showed leadership, been recognized in your community and in your school for things that you have done. Those are the major players when admissions reviewers are looking at your application. Secondary to that, we're going to have our activities, and that's really going to should paint a picture of who your child is as a student, right? Your sports, your clubs, your jobs, your hobbies, your community service. We always recommend quality over quantity. It's good to pick particular areas that have a personal meaning to you or areas that you have pursued for a long time. Being an Eagle Scout, that shows dedication to a cause over a long period of time and getting your project done. Community service. It's better to have your bulk of hours maybe be in one particular type of community service or in one particular place rather than picking up a handful of hours here and there at every opportunity. They like to see that longevity. And then personal, and this personal really comes in, especially if you decide to go test optional to a school. Your essays and your recommendations are the one place where your child gets a chance to express their voice and explain who they are. And the recommendations are a chance for people who know your child well in the academic and perhaps other settings, depending upon what a school's requirements are, to speak to how they know your child to be. And, I would say while the activities box is a little bit bigger, I think should you go test optional, that personal box should grow a little bit and take up a little bit more space there, because schools are going to really use that to see what type of person you are and to see how your GPA and course rigor is reflected in your own voice and your writing ability. So we take that part very seriously. Okay, what are test scores up to these days? They still do the same thing they have always done for colleges. They give us an apples to apples comparison across the US student body. So students applying from a school district in Kansas versus Nevada versus Florida versus here are all coming from a different batch of information. But an ACT or an SAT test is a national standard, and it does give the schools a rank, right? That's what they are looking for out of those tests. Where are you ranking in comparison to other students at your level? This can be very helpful when they have two applications in front of them with very similar students, very similar grades. The application with the test score is going to be just a bit stronger if that test score is sort of reinforcing what they're seeing on that page there. It just gives that admission officer a little bit more assurance that your child will be successful at their institution, because that's really what they're looking here for at this point. Yes, of course, they want to be competitive. They want to take kids with the best scores, but their goal is to enroll a student who will stay enrolled for 4 years, 5.5, whatever the average is now, and graduate successfully through their program. So they want to make sure that your child is able to handle the rigor of their school as they see it. And for students, it's going to help you validate and complement that GPA, right? Like I said, if you have a GPA that's a little bit on the weaker side, a good strong test score can be an indication of your potential that's there, and you can use that personal section of your application to maybe share some while you haven't had a chance to show that potential to its full effect in high school. And where you are coming in as a very strong student, again, it is a validator for the numbers that they are seeing to have on the page. And generally, because we have that recommendation of the balanced list, if test scores are if an achievable, relatively say above 60th percentile test score is available to you, you will probably use it on your probable schools or on your very likely schools. So it's good to have in hand just in case. And then sometimes I get last minute, kids decide at the last minute, I'm really interested in University of Central Florida. Okay, well, you're going to need a score for that school. And so going test optional is fine, but you do want to do a little bit of research just to make sure you're not going to end up later on finding out that you needed a test score when you did it. When is going test optional the best often? Okay, so honestly, most colleges identify as test optional right now. This definition will vary by school, so you want to read the fine print. Are they completely, some schools are like, oh, you can send them, but we're not even going to consider them. Most consider them. Some recommend them. Some prefer them. The sentences will vary as you go across school websites. Another place where it's a great place to look is in the common data set for any particular university. They have check boxes for each of the pieces of the application that basically will tell you how important those pieces are to them. So let's take Northeastern, for example. So I just know this one off the top of my head. It is test optional. However, if you go and look at their little check boxes, it is checked off as very important in their considerations. It gets the highest rank. And some of the Ivies are going to fall into that regard too, like UPenn. It's test optional, but they're very important. So that's a little bit of talking out of both sides of their mouth, right? We're making it test optional, but we're still really giving a lot of weight to these scores, which means if you are planning on schools like that, having them in hand, it's not a must have, but it really does help your chances. We do consider it a win-win for students, right? You are going to get to use that score where it works for you. You are going to get to hold it back where it doesn't. So that is a much better arrangement than being in the predicament of having to send a score to every school on your list, especially if standardized testing is more difficult for you. And you're going to decide where that it fits best, fits you best to use. And you'll make those decisions when application time rolls around August of senior year, as you move from August into the fall. Cons. It is going to put an extra spotlight on the rest of your application. So if you choose to go test optional, that just means those essays, those recommendations, your GPA, all of that stuff will get a little bit of a closer look. So you want to make sure all the pieces that you can control are as good as they can be to the best of your ability. And it may require extra application work or placement tests once at school. So every once in a while, a school will ask for additional information, or once you have been accepted, they may use the tests to place you in some of the basic math and English courses, depending upon what their course requirements are for their incoming freshmen. Catholic University is one of those schools. You do not have to submit your tests, but they do like to use them for placement for their first years. When are you going to submit? We believe in submitting when your median range or higher. So if you are in the 25th to the 75th percentile for what the schools are listing as their incoming scores, you should feel comfortable sending that score. I know some people out there will tell you that if you're in the 25th, don't do it, it's too low. No, because these scores are inflated, right? So we're not talking about all 100% of the kids coming in there. And even if we were, if you are still in that window, that is where the bulk of their applications are coming from. So if you have a score that's coming in just at that 25th percentile, or maybe even a little bit below, but it shores up your application and you're going to offer that score when 70% of the kids aren't, then go ahead and send it. We have our exceptions here. I've already mentioned some of them. All your Florida universities. Now, if the University of Miami is a private school, that doesn't count, but any of your state universities, University of Georgia, not particularly some of the other state schools in Georgia, but definitely University of Tennessee, appropriately Orange Box, MIT Georgetown, competitive programs. Engineering schools, direct admit to engineering schools, business schools, honors programs, nursing schools. We really do strongly recommend that you do your best to get a competitive score if you're going to be applying direct admit to a specific program, especially engineering. We just like to say there really isn't test optional engineering. It's a little bit like that MIT thing. They want to make sure that math and all those pieces are solid. So you really do want to have that represented on your application because, of course, if you're applying to a smaller program out of school, your admission rates are going to be more competitive than they are for the general university. So, personally, my own child is applying to a graphic design program. There's one particular school on our list. It's about 70% admission. Actually, there's two. The other one's even higher on the admission rates, but the admission to her programs are more in like the 20% range. So it's something to keep in mind. So even if you have an art student, I should start including that in there. You may be, fighting for less spaces with more people in a more competitive environment than you would for the school overall. First year placements, right? So not having to take some of those remedial courses over again. So when you're paying for credit hours and you got to knock stuff out, you may want to watch out for that. Merit aid. So we still have a good number of competitive universities that are still relying on, or not competitive, but a good number of universities, because there's a wide range that do still have straight up formulas for merit aid. University of Alabama is one that comes to mind. If you have this grade and you have this test score, it's a certain amount off every year. Right. But it's test optional and you don't necessarily know that when you go to apply, but then you find out later, well, if I'd had an ACT score of 26, I could have saved myself $6,000 a year. So it's definitely a question to ask when you're out on your tours and doing your research to find out if there are any straight up merit aid structures and, just X plus Y gives you a discount, and then you want to make sure you have scores in line for that. Athletes. Not so much for admission, but to a certain extent, sometimes coaches, it's an easy way for them to decide if that student's going to be of the caliber that their school would be looking at. Find that some coaches are still looking for schools. And, keep in mind that score inflation is out there. So when you use those schools, we already talked about it, it's going to need to be a little bit higher than it was before. Okay. So now you kind of understand when to use them and when to not. And again, it is super relative, but it'll all sort out when you have your list in front of you and your child in front of you, and you're getting ready to do this and send them all off. So if you do decide you're going to go into this, how are you going to pick? So each college is treating both of these tests equally. So you really just want to go with the one that works best. Now, a few of you have kind of been through our program already, so you understand some of this. We have some similarities, but this year we have a huge branch off, and that the SAT is taking on its digital format in 2024. So while we still have some similarities in that both test reading and writing and math, we are going to have some very distinct differences in the platforms and in the skills and strategies that will work best for your student to get the good score. You got about 2 to 3 hours testing time, depending upon which you choose. Reading comprehension is super important. Parents ask me all the time, what can we be doing ahead of time? You can be reading. Doesn't have to be hard or difficult, but try to develop a good relationship with some recreational reading. It's the only way to get better at it, and it helps across all walks of life, and it is the #1 player in these tests. Grammar knowledge, a little tougher for our MCPS kids. We don't do any formal grammar instruction. So most of my kids right now coming in, their lowest scores are in grammar. And we really want to see proficiency up through Algebra 2. There's no pre-calc on these tests, but if you are in pre-calc, you are in a much better position to handle some of the advanced math, especially of what you will see on the new digital SAT. How they test is very different. So ACT, it favors verbal, well-read students and lower level math students. And by lower level, it doesn't mean you're not good at math. It just means maybe it doesn't come naturally to you. It's not a space that you move in with a lot of flexible thinking. You can do math when you're, kind of in the zone for it, but maybe it's not just your natural state of being. It balls the whole test into one score. Right. So your English, your reading, your math, and your science sections are going to average out to be one overall score. It's a speeded test. It's very fast, but we don't have to finish to do well. Strategies can maximize correct answers over finishing. And your overall score is going to rely 75% on your verbal abilities. So if you do lean that way, liking letters better than numbers, ACT is probably a better fit for you. The science section is a reading section. It'll scare off a lot of my kids because they see that there and they're like, I'm not great at science, but if you read well, science section is fine. Talked about it being speeded. The ACT, the average time you get per question across the whole test, so it varies a little bit per section, is about 47 seconds. Right now on the digital SAT, we're at 90 seconds. So you do need to be able to move a little faster, but at the end of the day, we don't have to answer all those questions to get a competitive score. Now the SAT favors students who can conquer the highest difficulty level questions, right? So that means students that can really sort of noodle out those puzzly questions and not be intimidated by them. Because the test is half reading, half math, and they stand independently, you've got to have strong math skills going into your SAT. And general changes now show that strong reading comprehension is needed everywhere, right? That's not universal. Nerves of steel. This is a new admit here. So I think the next slide explains the test structure a little bit, but because of the adaptive nature of the test, students have 2 modules each, 2 modules in math, 2 modules in reading and writing. Your performance on that first module will unlock the higher performing module on the second end. So you must have nerves of steel. You must go into that first module with just the competitive instinct to nail every single one of those questions so that you can open the door to the higher ranking score. And I think for students that maybe have some test anxiety or are unsure in standardized tests, who need a little bit more flexibility in how they attack the test, the ACT is going to be a better fit. Schools and track and rank those reading and math scores separately. So they just consider them independent tests. So you need to rank pretty well in both reading and math if you want the best chance of meeting the metrics at the schools of your choice. And we got to have a high level of accuracy. We have gone from 58 math questions to 44. We have gone from 96 English questions to 27, so 54. So it's almost half, which means there's not a lot of room for error. So now the SAT is shorter, it takes you less time, but those questions are way more, each question is way more important to your score than it used to be. And we got to get them all answered. So if that extra time is not enough time for your student, it's better to deal with the pacing of the ACT than to come up short on your SAT answers. Here's a little bit more on the digital adaptive test. The test time has been reduced by 1 hour. This is great for students that have attentional issues or have trouble with the stamina to get through a 3+ hour test. Con to that, fewer questions mean they each count more. So your module 1 results are going to unlock whether you get an easy or harder. So module 1 is going to be the same for everybody, even division of easy, medium, and hard questions. And the student performance on that is going to dictate whether you get access to an easier or harder module. What's the difference in that? I would say with the easier module, what I'm seeing right now is maybe we can top out our scores in the mid 500s, close to 600. If you want that 600 to 800 range score, you have to make it to that harder module on the second side. Reading and writing, the long passage is gone. We are down to short 100 word, 150 word passages with one question each. But students are going to have to analyze poetry. They're going to have to take notes and combine them into prose. We've got our archaic language. So just because we're not dealing with a long passage, it also means we don't have a whole lot of context to pull from. We have to be able to discreetly get that answer out. Writing's also gone to discrete questions. Previously, it was a whole passage, parts were underlined, you corrected. Now you're going to get individual questions about your grammar stuff. And vocabulary's kind of snuck its way back in there. We got some fill in the blanks here where they're looking for that best word. It's basically a sentence completion. So we are seeing students who need a better level of working vocabulary than they did on the paper version. And we will see how March 9th will be our first national administration. The county will offer this test to students in March as well. Everybody needs to bring their own device. During the PSAT across the county, some schools had more successful administrations than others. It was not the school's issue. College Board server went down to a certain extent. You need to make sure your device is charged, all these other things. There's not much that can go wrong with a paper booklet and your bubble sheet and your pencil. Worst thing that usually happened to my kids on test day is that their calculator would conk out. But on this new digital test, I think through the first few administrations, as schools figure out how best to proctor it, as the College Board figures out how best to handle the volume of all the students across the nation testing at the same time, it's probably going to be a little bumpy. And chances are there will be some tweaking here over the first year to two of tests as they figure out what works and what needs to try. If you're interested in trying it, we have a digital test available for diagnostic. Certainly, we're always of the mind that you try them both and see how it goes. But we do have those available if you're curious about it, or you missed the PSAT in October, or even if you took that PSAT, it's just a big number in the unknown to me as far as I'm concerned. I would love to see a second digital number to see how those PSAT scores are tracking when you take that step up to the higher level math we see on the SAT. Okay. And then, yeah, this is just our general standard process. A strong recommendation that as you look toward tests and decide whether to be optional or not, the best thing you can do at the front end is try them both, find out where you are, and think about that in context to the type of schools that you're looking at. If you are in striking distance of the schools that you are seeking within your test scores, and it's worth the time and investment to go after it. If it's going to be an exercise in frustration for your student, or it's just not, you have certain schools and programs in mind and the test scores don't match, but the grades and all the other things do, it's okay. You can go test optional. We'll take both those tests. We'll talk all that stuff through. I do make test optional recommendations quite frequently. Just because we have a prep center doesn't mean I want to prep all the students that I see come through our review meetings. We do really focus on what's best for the kids, and I take that very seriously. And then if you decide to launch and tackle a test for we can plan it out, we can timeline it, set some score targets to help get it done. This has a lot of information on it, but I know some of you are sort of, depending upon where you are, this is really our preferred timeline for things. Spring of sophomore year, get those diagnostic tests done. As long as your student is most of the way through Algebra 2, and most of the MCPS kids are almost on pre-calculus too, you go ahead and you tackle it, figure out which test is going to be a better fit for you. It just allows you a lot of planning to get things lined up if you want to do any prep during the summer and focus on fall tests, which we really think is the best fit for kids. You can also plan your summer activities. So thinking about jobs and community service and thinking about that resume building piece of your application. It's not a bad time to take any of those personality tests or career profiles out there, especially if you're not sure what you think you might be interested in. My favorite question in that regard is asking your child what they're proud of. What have they done that they're proud of? It's very hard to ask them, what do they want to be? What do they want to do? But ask them what they've enjoyed doing, what they've taken pride in doing, and it can kind of give you an insight to where they might thrive professionally. Start researching college types and majors. After you find out what they're proud of and interested in, what does that lend itself to? What kind of schools have good programs for that? It's never too early to start thinking about this stuff. And you can see I have scholarship applications all along the way. A lot of people only start thinking about those scholarships when they get to senior year, but there are plenty of scholarships out there that are open to all high school students. And there are aggregates out there. There's great Substacks where you can kind of get a scholarship a day to what you're interested in. And if you start early, getting some of those in and getting used to doing them. Sometimes they're only $2,000 or $1,000, but you know what? If you pick up 4 or 5 of those over the course of your couple of years as you get ready to do your application, it's not a bad nest egg to put towards your tuitions. Then you're going to work into your summer stuff. Fall of junior year is really what we find the ideal time to do your prep and tests if you are going to do it. Why? You've had your math. You are fresh off your sophomore year. The intensity of junior year has not played out yet. You're still in first quarter. We will accept football players, palms, and cheerleaders from this batch. They will probably just have to wait to the winter. But for most students, this is just a really great time to take the SAT and ACT. You can get 1 or 2 of them done and be wrapped up before Thanksgiving, which is just stick that on the shelf. And this also really needs to be when you are encouraging your child to at least come up with some kind of preliminary list. There's virtual sessions that schools are doing, and reps are coming in. It's a really good time to just start thinking about it, because by spring, you really want to be in a position where you can start embarking upon visits. So you want to have a pretty good working list by the time you got there. In order to do that, got to start thinking about it in the fall. Winter. And we should probably back up a little bit too. But if you want to be an engineering major, make sure you're taking those electives. If you are interested in science, try to get into those AP labs and things. Try to line your courses up with what you might be interested in. That's very important when you're looking at a direct admit into particular programs or particularly competitive majors at schools. And then as you run to the spring, we really, you want to finish strong junior year. Junior year is going to be the year that everybody focuses on with that GPA. Yes, you have freshman year, you have sophomore year, but colleges account for transitions into high school. They account for bumpy roads, but really by junior year, your student should have found themselves. They should understand how they can challenge themselves to their best success. They should have a good year. So we really want to see an upward trajectory of GPA if there was any rough spots, or a good steady hold as you move through junior year, because that's going to be the most important year that colleges will look at. So you really want to have all this test prep and, to a certain extent, your college list and all that planning stuff off your plate, so that your student really, between spring break to the end of the year, can really just concentrate on being successful, which is why we don't recommend saving your tests until then, because they got enough on their plate with AP exams and just getting through third and fourth quarter of junior year that they should not be having to take, take tests if they need to. And if they do, then we'll find a place to fit it in there without overwhelming them, but try to start early. Summer 11. This is when we got to start getting into the nitty gritty, right? You're going to get that copy of that transcript, see if there's any errors you have to address with your school. You're going to start wanting to think about what your general essay will be on the Common App. There's 5 general prompts you can choose from. Most kids go with what do we consider a personal statement. It's very flexible. It can also usually be used at schools that don't participate in the Common App if you happen to have any of those. You're going to continue your visits. School year visits are a little better. The kids are there. You can kind of see what's happening. But if summer is when you guys can get it done, then go and get it done. It's very important, we feel, for the kids to get a sense for what the campuses are really like. Finalize that list, because on August 1st, those applications start, and you really want to be in the position to do as many as you can as early as you can for your students' sake, so that they can just enjoy senior year as much as possible and get all that stuff off your plate. If you have any tests to wrap up, we got some fall dates. Continue asking for money from anybody and anybody will give you some. And then fall 12th. So that's when everything's going to start ticking in. You have your rolling admits, you have your November 1st deadline for your Maryland schools. Any Maryland schools you want to apply by then. November 15th is a very popular early action date or early decision date. December 1st is another. Usually by December 15th, your early runs are done. And then January are your regular ones. For parents, this is going to be the time when you're going to be completing the FAFSA. Any other financial forms, some schools require what's called the CSS. It's a different profile, also managed by the College Board, who manages the SAT. That requires a lot of extra information. And you are going to need to do that so that the schools can offer you a financial aid packet. So you got to plan in time to get that done. Having done that this year, a lot of nitty gritty. You get out all your papers and you sit down. Every school also has a tuition calculator. So it's a very good place to go. Some schools ask for more info than others, but you can put in your students' info and get a general sense of what your sticker price is going to be for that school. And we do generally recommend doing that sooner rather than later as you build your list. It's a lot of parents will say, well, we'll apply and we'll figure it out later. But I think it's most fair to the students for us parents to have a good understanding of financially what will be a good fit and what's doable, because you don't want to break your kids' hearts and college is expensive. And if some of them are out there and if aid is not offered or the finance packet, it just may not be doable. And as long as that conversation can be had with the child and say, okay, this is here, but it may not be possible depending upon what it was. If you can have that conversation ahead of time, I think that just goes over better for everybody in the family than later on determining that it's not something that's going to be feasible when a student maybe has their heart set on something and has been accepted somewhere, and that it's just tough. It's tough being a parent, so let's try to make it easier on everybody by getting our financial ducks in a row ahead of time and making sure our college list reflects that. Okay, what should we do here? We start researching ASAP, right? You start thinking about schools, you start thinking about finances, you get your kids thinking about it. Try out each of those tests. Find out where you are on the test optional scheme, whether you're going to use it for everything or whether you're going to use it for some. And then if you are going to use it for some, well, I think I meant whether you're not going to use it or you're going to use it for some, get that test in and have one in your pocket. And keep up with your school's test optional policies. Any schools that may change over will do so usually in the spring once they're kind of done with their admissions run. So usually around February or so, because most answers will go out to seniors by mid-February, end of February for all admission runs. So at that point, a school may decide to change their posture for the next year. We haven't seen too many of them, but each year 1 or 2 go. And admissions are competitive, but there are schools out there perfect for everyone. We believe in the holistic fit for a child. You pick what's best for them, where they will thrive, because that is where they will get the best education, and that's where your investment will go the furthest. And you want to make sure it's a good fit for them, not only academically and socially. Well, I guess academically is what I'm trying to say, because if they go to a very, very competitive school, but they're just a kind of competitive kid, may not end up being the best fit for them. Okay, where are we here? Ah, yes, my little blip here. So if you need help with any of these pieces, we are here. Subject support to get through their classes, fundamental skills. This is a big one right now because we're coming out of this middle school gap for my kids where they're in online learning, kind of fell in those seventh, eighth grade years for my sophomores and juniors right now. And we're just finding that we're missing some big holes in some baseline math, reading and writing. We got testing, diagnostic testing is the key to sort of figuring out this test optional path. We got prep classes and private tutoring. And then whether you need that or whether you opt to go test optional, you just want support with kind of, figuring out your list development, fixing your courses, paving the best path. We have that support available to you as well. We try to be full service. So I'm going to turn my pictures back on here so I can see folks because I had to move them so I could see my presentation. That was a lot of talking. You guys got any questions out there?
And I had a question. You were talking about the schools that have the test optional information. You referenced where you could find it on with like the check marks. Can you tell me where that is again?
Right. So what any school that receives financing from the government in some way, and almost all schools do, it's called the Common Data Set. So the easiest way to get to it is honestly, you type in University of Maryland, College Park Common Data Set. And it's usually one of the first or two links you get to. Some schools just link you direct to their Excel sheet that has different tabs with all the information on it, but it gives you all the wonderful breakdowns about incoming scores for kit into the class, how many people submitted tests, how many applied, how many were admitted, that range of which pieces of applications are important or not, the makeup of the class, all those good pieces in there. So it's a very good resource and it's accessible for anybody. And it's a really good place to kind of figure out what's behind the curtain on their website, so to speak.
Thank you.
You are welcome.
Pam, this was great. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
You are welcome.
I do need a drink now, but it's not really your fault. So
no, I'm not going to take the blame for that one, but yeah. It is possible, having a 12th grader, I finally got to practice what I preached for so long. But if you kind of do it in these little incremental steps, you get where we are. And on Friday, we send off, I think, all but one of the applications, so we can call this done.
Good luck.
Thank you. Okay. Let me see if anybody else has come in. Oh, I forgot to, okay. I hope I didn't leave anybody stranded in the waiting room. Okay. Somebody had a question, but they weren't here. They had sent it ahead of time, so I will shoot them an email because I'm trying to remember what their question was. Okay. Anybody else? It's okay if we don't have questions, but if you do, I'm happy to answer them. Oh, here we go. This is a question, in case this parent watches it on the recording. Should we take more than one SAT or ACT to try to score the highest possible, and when we should take the test? We covered when we should take them, sooner rather than later. It'll vary for everybody depending upon what, their school and other academic responsibilities are. Should you take it more than once? If you decide to pursue the test, I am a two-test person. You never know what's going to happen on that first test day. It can go really great. It can not go as great as you would like. And most schools, even the high competitive ones now, are taking a super score posture. They're going to let you put your best section scores together from your different tests. So it is in your best interest to try the test more than once. And many students find that they just really need to get to a certain level of comfort with the tests and themselves and their strategies. And so sometimes it doesn't even pop out till like the third test, but it's usually in there. And it just depends upon the student's motivation and willingness to kind of keep at it. All right.
And this is Marco. Can you hear me?
Hello. I can,
Hi.
Marco. Hello.
However, I'm trying to show my face.
Oh, there you go.
Yes. So a question. So are there differences between SAT and ACT from the college perspective? Like maybe some colleges prefer an SAT, VS like an ACT. Maybe depending on majors or types of school. Yeah, my daughter is interested in psychology, right? So should she take like an ACT or SAT, for example?
It does, right, yes. We find across the board that it does not matter. It is a national yardstick. So schools take either without bias. So there's a lot of like chatter out there. I heard somebody say once, well, Kentucky really likes SATs. I don't think so, but okay. So it really is just a national marker, and the schools, the ACT has been around since the 50s, the SAT has been around since the dinosaurs, but both scores are respected. So it does not matter. So if she's interested in psychology, which test she should take the one she can get the better score on, right? And that's usually the answer, right? Because we want to get the best number in there. Now, the ACT is a lesser used test these days. That was not the case about, where are we in the cycle of things? So the last time the SAT changed, it was 2016. And the reason they did that was because they lost their market share to the SAT. All of a sudden, for the last 3 or 4 years, more kids had taken ACTs than SAT. That made the College Board very nervous. So they decided to do something about it, and they revamped their tests. So it really is just a Coke and Pepsi situation. You may like one better than the other, but they're both a brown and sugary soda.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. Last call.
Hi, Anne. And I have
Hello.
one question. Hi, Anne.
Hello.
This is Misan. Can you hear me?
Hello, Misan. I can.
I'm sorry, I cannot turn on video because I am in pajamas now already. Hope you understand. And thank you so much for.
I'll be there soon. Go for it.
Thank you so much for your very informative session. Very helpful. In case my daughter takes ACT, I heard that there is an essay part. Is it necessarily, I know it's optional, but do they give more credit if they take that essay portion?
No, they do not. So right now, ACT still offers that essay. If you have a student that's going to apply to West Point, they got to take that essay. Other than that, we don't have required anywhere. And what we do tell parents as they manage this applications process is that you very much only want to give the schools what they ask for. If they ask for one recommendation, you send one recommendation. You don't send 3 recommendations. They almost no schools except West Point will accept that writing test. So don't spend the money on it. Don't worry about preparing for it. The ACT with multiple choice will be just fine. And just as a secondary warning, part of that applications process is just following directions, right? So like a school that doesn't want your scores, don't send their scores. Don't try to sneak them in, like the University of California. Don't try to sneak them into your essay, right? Just follow the directions. They only have boxes to put the things in that they've asked for. So anything you send outside of that is never going to get looked at. And to a certain extent, if you overwhelm your admission officer, it's also probably not great.
Okay, thank you so much.
Okay, you're welcome. All right, we didn't do too bad, less than an hour. Final call. Good night, Chad. Good night, Ken.
Thank you.
You are very welcome. Thanks for coming.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome, Misan.